For the past 25 plus years, if you wanted to find information on the internet, you would type in a handful of keywords into a Google search bar, and you would get a bunch of blue links returned to you, and the burden would be on you, the user, to click through those blue links and determine what's relevant to whatever your search was, and to collate and synthesize that information into an answer that's most relevant to you. Now, you can go to an LLM and you can type in a much longer, much more highly contextualized prompt specific to your use case. For B2B buyers, which is what we focus on, an example might be, I'm a CMO at a mid-market fintech company. I manage a team of 30, and we're looking for an email automation platform that integrates with our current CRM. And then the LLM goes out and performs dozens of searches in real time, and it references its own training data as well. And then it synthesizes an answer directly relevant to you in real time. It's a much more efficient way to do research, and a much better way to get more relevant content surfaced to you directly.
Hey everybody, I'm Hunter. Welcome to the Build and Breakthrough podcast, where we celebrate founders' successes and struggles. With me today is Shane H. Tepper, the founder of Resonate Labs and Retina Media. He's also the author of Cited, How B2B Brands Win in the Age of AI-Generated Answers. Very excited to have him on the podcast today to talk about GEO, Generative Engine Optimization. Shane, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I think you covered the basics. I'm Shane H. Tepper. I am the co-founder of Resonate Labs and the founder of Retina Media. My background is largely in copywriting and content production and content strategy. And over the past year or so, I've become very involved in this emerging world of GEO, of Generative Engine Optimization. So I think that covers pretty much the basics.
Cool. I guess to kick this off, do you have any questions for me?
Sure. Yeah. So for someone who's working within, an emerging space such as this one, what would be the key pieces of advice you would give to a founder, is in a space that is rapidly changing and is relatively new, such as this one?
Interestingly enough, the advice that I would give you is counter to a lot of advice I give other people. Most people I talk to, I say, be aware of the bleeding edge and stay a bit off it. The general recommendation that I have for most people is stay about 2 weeks behind the hype. If something emerges out and everyone's really excited about it, you don't need to immediately go research it. There's other earlier adopters who can spend a bunch of time doing that for you. You are not in that demographic, unfortunately. You have a lot more work directly in store for you, because your competitive edge is literally staying on that bleeding edge, which means that you have to invest a lot more time in just staying on, like OpenClaw, for example. Does OpenClaw change Geo? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Like, there's a new memory innovation that people have been talking about this week, made by actually Mila Jovovich, the actress Mila Jovovich, that changes how LLMs store memories for people. So how does that interact with their querying activities, for example? Additionally, like, Geo as a space inherits, I think, a lot from SEO, with it just being like an absolutely bloodthirsty, like, arms race type of space. So that further accelerates it too, to where, like, my overall advice would say, you probably can't do it on a daily basis, but at least on a weekly basis. I usually recommend founders like pour themselves a glass of wine and operationalize their business, say like 1 day a week. So pour yourself a glass of wine, pull up your favorite TV show, Friends, or whatever it is, and just spend 4 hours like figuring out ways to make your business a bit more efficient. And that sort of compounding improvement accelerates your business over time. For you, it's the same basic model, but it's more like just trying to consume and grasp the ramifications of the changes in the industry. So pour yourself a glass of wine, put on Friends or whatever your comfort TV show is, and go and figure out, like, okay, these 8 things seem to be like the biggest news in the industry. Like, let's say I think it's Memory Palace this week, Mythos from Claude, for example, obviously big news this week, so on and so forth, and just try and, however it works for you. Maybe it's writing an article, maybe it's like working with Colin, for example, and doing some sort of tech demo with some piece of the technology, but just trying to figure out, is this a thing that's going to disrupt our existing geo efforts? Is this a thing that we need to get ahead of? Is this an opportunity? Is this a danger? And just making sure categorizing all of those and staying just right on that bleeding edge, because I guarantee you there's other people in the space that are doing exactly that.
Yeah, no, that's really good advice. It's really well taken. And that's kind of, what I did when I wrote the book, when I wrote Cited was,
Okay.
look at a lot of data, the data that's accumulated over the past, 10 months or so since I've really been working in this space, and kind of trying to see what's remained consistent, what patterns have been established, and then maybe what things were once true but are no longer true. And then also, trying to look at trends and try and, make more, predictive observations about what, where the industry is heading as well. So, it's good to hear you kind of echo that back to me, because that's pretty much what I've been doing. I consume every single vendor study, every single analyst report on the topic of GEO, AEO, LLMO, whatever you want to call
Mm-hmm.
this field, this industry, this category. And yeah, and then it's ultimately about kind of separating, the wheat from the chaff, to use that cliche. What is real, what's persistent, what is consistent, and then what kind of like is more of like a something that pops up and then fades away as not being particularly important or relevant.
Yeah, you use one particular term that I want to make sure I call back to, which is predictive observations. Like the most important thing that I think I want to highlight for the viewership of this in terms of what you're doing is the real key here is like those predictive observations, because you have to make calls before the evidence is fully out there in a space like this, right? So the key there is creating a habit of like clearly stating hypotheses, like saying, hey, I think this particular thing is going to affect the market in this particular way, and holding yourself accountable to those observations as well, like writing that down, like doing the digital equivalent of writing yourself a letter, like postmarking it and sending it out for delivery a year from now or
Future
whatever,
shame,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Exactly. Like you have to be able to make those hypotheses and have some cadence of revisiting those and basically saying like, okay, I thought based on this evidence that this was going to happen, and I was right on points A, B, C, and wrong about points D, E. So like gold star on the first three, but let's figure out how we can dial in our predictive powers to account for those remaining two. Or, similarly, like, oh, I was way off. I made this prediction and turned out to be wildly different. The act of writing it down and revisiting it is really powerful in terms of giving yourself that feedback. And like, I really believe predictive ability is a skill that can be honed. And I've worked with a number of operators that are really good at it, and all of them have that specific cadence of pushing themselves with accountability. I mean, it's not like you have to self-flagellate just because you got something wrong. You do need to acknowledge that you got things right or got
it's a
things
data point,
wrong.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
just another data point, yeah.
So, calling back to what I mentioned briefly about SEO, one of the things that I wanted to dive in with you first of all is because this is super new. I think pretty much any founder is going to be aware of SEO at the very least, but I will say that geo is not on the radar of many people that I'm talking to at the moment, which is part of the reason why this is an exciting conversation for me. Why don't you run me through the basics of geo? Not just like how it works, but like, why is this an opportunity now? What's the real opportunity for me as someone that is unoptimized in geo to start putting geo on my OKRs or what have you, and starting to look critically at the space?
Sure. Yeah. So let's start with a broad overview first, distinguishing SEO and GEO. For the past 25 plus years, if you wanted to find information on the internet, you would type in a handful of keywords into a Google search bar, and you would get a bunch of blue links returned to you. And the burden would be on you, the user, to click through those blue links and determine what's relevant to whatever your search was, and to collate and synthesize that information into an answer that's most relevant to you. It was time consuming. Most of the time when you click through those links, you didn't find a lot of information that was particularly helpful for you, and you were searching within relatively narrow parameters using just a handful of keywords. Versus now, you can go to an LLM and you can type in a much longer, much more highly contextualized prompt specific to your use case. For B2B buyers, which is what we focus on, an example might be, I'm a CMO at a mid-market fintech company. I manage a team of 30, and we're looking for an email automation platform that integrates with our current CRM. and then the LLM goes out and performs dozens of searches in real time, and it references its own training data as well, and then it synthesizes an answer directly relevant to you in real time. It's a much more efficient way to do research and a much better way to get more relevant content surfaced to you directly. So people are starting to migrate to LLMs for research purposes, particularly B2B buyers. And we are seeing that this is a much more high intent type of buyer. They convert at a rate of anywhere between 4 and 23 times the rate of people who are searching on, doing traditional Google searches. It's a growing surface for discovery and comparison, particularly for B2B tech solutions. So that kind of answers your questions about what makes it different and why is it something that businesses, particularly B2B companies, should be paying attention to. As far as what makes it different or what sorts of techniques and practices apply to GEO versus SEO, there is, semantic clarity is always a very important one. Structured content is an important one, but we're also seeing that a lot of the indicators of strong SEO don't necessarily apply to GEO. For instance, there is a 5% correlation between traffic and discoverability on AI services. There's also a less than 5% overlap between backlinks, the presence of backlinks, and the likelihood that a web page will surface on an AI search. So a lot of these traditional signals that would indicate that your brand is discoverable on Google and on a traditional search engine is not the case for GEO. Furthermore, we're seeing that 90% of the content that is surfaced on AI interfaces comes from Google's 20 search engine results page or deeper.
Really?
These models are using fundamentally different criteria to determine what content is credible, authoritative, trustworthy, what have you, when they retrieve that information and pull it into a synthesized answer.
Very interesting. So I guess you partially answered this, but what is some of the information they're using for establishing credibility?
Yeah, it's really difficult to say, and the only way to get that answer is to get a large set of queries, run them through the individual LLMs, and by the way, the individual LLMs also have a lot of divergence when it comes to what sources they consider to be credible, authoritative, trustworthy, etc. So it's done on a per model basis as well. Like, you don't optimize for AI or LLMs. That's like saying I optimize for social media, right? That's not a thing. You have a different strategy for LinkedIn versus
For humans, right?
yeah, exactly.
It's a little nonsensical.
It's a bit nonsensical. What we do know for certain is that third-party citations are very important, right?
Okay.
What the models are essentially doing across the models, what they're doing is they're wanting to make sure that the claims that you're making on your own web properties, on your own domain, are validated by third-party sources, right? So you can make a claim about what your product does, the pain points that you address, your features, your positioning, all that sort of stuff. You could make claims about, but then the models also need to validate that through whether it's user forums or industry publications. They're essentially validating that what you're saying is being repeated by someone outside of your own organization.
That's very interesting. So that's a little bit similar to backlinks, but it sounds like the context of the link plays significantly more in terms of the geo space versus the SEO space.
Yeah. It's the presence of backlinks on the domain itself isn't nearly as important as, basically the models being able to see that what is being claimed on your website is also being claimed by an independent third party. So it's not the connection that matters, it's the semantic
Context
meaning.
around it.
Yeah, the context, yes.
That's really interesting. And that is very, very different. I guess given that you've been in this space for a number of years, it does sound like this is rapidly evolving. What are some of the changes that you've seen occur bit by bit in this space?
Yeah, one of the biggest ones is that the citation sources themselves, and this is true across models, they churn by 50% or more month over month. So what
Hmm.
ChatGPT or Perplexity or Gemini or Claude is citing, in April might not be what it's citing in June, right? So that's
Interesting.
another thing that makes the GEO approach, that distinguishes the approach for GEO different than SEO. SEO is sort of the thing, you implement best practices one time, obviously, across your website. Obviously, freshness of content, like
Of course.
continuing to produce fresh content, is important. But basically, once you get your sort of technical baseline established, optimized for Google, you're pretty good, for you've done most of the work. Whereas for GEO, because of the way the models are constantly reevaluating what's important, constantly reevaluating, constantly revising the criteria by which they're selecting which content to pull into an answer, you kind of have to remain more vigilant and take a more active role in creating and monitoring those things, monitoring what citation sources are being pulled into these models, more of like a more continuously adapt your strategy accordingly.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It sounds like it's much more of a moving target than SEO historically has been. I mean, SEO also has been to a certain extent a moving target, but the overall approach has been more consistent than this at the very least. So it sounds like,
More
and this is,
volatility, more
yeah,
volatility.
volatility is a good word to use for this. Yeah. So I guess this goes into a little bit of kind of like your model for going about geo, but it does sound like you really have to do an evaluation of what queries are relevant on a pretty regular basis. Do you mind running me through the overall approach with like the knowledge graph and the different set of queries? You kind of alluded to the different set of queries, but I know the
Certainly.
knowledge graph piece, and I don't think that we've discussed that quite yet.
Yeah. No, let's talk about that. So when we work with a client, the first thing we do is we put together, as you alluded to, a knowledge graph, a comprehensive knowledge graph about that company that is essentially like the source of truth about everything that has to do with the company, its offerings, its ICPs, its ideal customer profiles, the pain points that it solves, any question, any sort of topic that might come up at any stage in the buying journey for any of these ideal customer profiles. And we supplement that with competitive data about other players in that industry, about other companies in the industry, and then other information about the industry at large. And then this becomes sort of like the reference document that informs everything downstream of that point of this sort of discovery process that we conduct. So we align with the customer that, like, yes, these are your top competitors, these are your offerings, these are the pain points. These are some other things that are true about your industry. We get alignment on that. And then what we do is we generate a vast query set that is representative of what their best buyers are asking at all points of the buyer journey in the language that buyer uses, right? So
Mhm.
not using, buyers aren't searching for, best in class solution, right? Or top of the line, blah, 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 right? This is language that marketers use, not language that buyers use. So we have a query set that covers all those dimensions that I alluded to. We run them through the models that we believe that their best buyers are using to ask these types of questions. We generate a ton of response data across those different models. And then what we do is we sort of just slice and dice and analyze this data from across those different dimensions. We see what citation sources are coming back. We see where competitors are dominating certain queries or query clusters, as we refer to them, queries that are sort of like grouped around a similar topic. And then we come up with an action plan, pieces of content, generally 120 plus pieces of content that, according to this data, according to this response data, we believe that the client should be creating and deploying on their own website, and as well as recommendations for where to do off-domain third-party placements. So if we're seeing that a particular, if we're seeing that G2, for instance, is something that is referenced a lot in the responses, or if a particular industry publication is being referenced a lot, we'll create briefs and help them with outreach to try and get placements on those off-domain sites as well.
Interesting. Yeah. So overall, it sounds like, and I'm trying to like summarize this a little bit here, but it sounds like the LLMs their training data, their fine tuning, their prompts, etc. I shouldn't say their prompt because you are prompting them, but their overall system prompt and context are enough of a black box that you're generating the knowledge graph as a set of queries, well, a set of information creates a large set of queries that's multiplexed out to Claude, to Perplexity, to ChatGPT, and then essentially you're inferring based on the received information. Like it's pretty straightforward to use the example of like G2, but it is really interesting to see those like on domain things. I assume it's like common threads of like these 5 offerings were highly rated for security and we reference their security policy, and your website doesn't have a on domain security policy, for example, right?
Right, right,
These sorts
exactly.
of like inferred commonalities to where essentially if they're looking at similar URLs or similar types of pages, you can at least go back to the person that you're working with and say, hey, you should probably have a page like this because the LLM zeitgeist of the moment is frequently referencing this
Right.
kind of page.
We're seeing your competitors' pages on security or speed of implementation
Mhm.
or ease of implement, whatever the topic is, be cited in response to these queries or these particular queries that are being asked by this particular persona at this particular point in the buying journey. You don't have anything like that. We need to create that. On the flip side of that, the audit, as we call it, that's the first part of what we do is this audit
Mhm.
piece, and then there's the execution piece, right? There's the audit, we have the content fix recommendations, and then we also have a separate system for executing on the content, but I'll return to that in a moment. So the audit might reveal an area where you're being outcompeted by a competitor in your category. It also might reveal a gap. No one, competitor A is owning the most compliant narrative. Competitor B is owning the speed of the solution narrative, but the ease of implementation narrative is wide open. No one has really claimed that, and that represents an opportunity for you to come in and own those queries that revolve
Interesting.
around that particular topic. Something that I neglected to mention earlier is that when we give recommendations on fixes, it comes in a 3-layer package, let's call it.
Mhm.
Layer 1 is technical. Oftentimes this is like a binary thing. For instance, if your CMS serves, does like client side JavaScript rendering, that's something that LLMs typically don't like. So no
Very
matter
much
how
so.
good your content is, if the crawler bots can't see it, like they're not going to be able to extract it, ingest it, and surface it in a so right. So that's number one, is making sure that your website is generally technically optimized to permit LLMs. The second layer is enhancing existing content in your website. So if you have a page that addresses a topic that is germane to
Mhm.
query clusters, but it's not deep enough, it doesn't have enough information or not specific enough information, because LLMs tend to like very specific information, then we'll make recommendations for you, so for you to improve those pages with the particular specific type of information that we're seeing the LLMs retrieving elsewhere. And then the third is the net new content. This is content that does not yet exist on your website, that you need to have on your website in order to address gaps that we're seeing in your audit or places where you're being outcompeted by other companies in your category.
So based on my conversation with Colin, for the most part, it seems like you're doing these on kind of like a monthly cadence at the moment. But like, how bleeding edge have y'all gotten with this? Like, if this was, if you were generating a report, let's say like every week or every day, what sort of velocity of change do you think you'd be seeing?
Yeah, it's hard to say. Like you said, we've been doing a monthly cadence. We'd eventually like to get to a point where the system is kind of like updating itself in real time on a,
Hmm.
I don't know, hourly or once every 12-hour cadence, something like that. But there have been instances where we've seen improvements in visibility within just a handful of days.
Interesting.
When we create new content, we go to Google Search Console and request that it gets indexed. So we do some stuff that sort of brute forces the recognition of that content, that new content that we create. Not that content that, not that being indexed by Google is a guarantee that it's going to be pulled into an LLM, as for
But
reasons
it
of research.
certainly won't hurt.
But it certainly doesn't hurt. It's a place to start. So yeah, I think it depends. It's also very contingent on their starting visibility, like their
Hmm.
status quo baseline visibility. So if they're like, have like 5% visibility, something very low, and we start creating content in an optimized way that gets indexed quickly, you tend to see a noticeable lift in visibility fairly quickly versus if it's a much more if they're more tight in a more tight competitive arrangement with other companies in their category, it tends to be more incremental.
It's also probably part Pareto principle, right? Like if I'm completely non-geo optimized, even trivial improvements probably give me leaps and bounds in terms of geo. But then once I'm pretty heavily optimized,
Yeah,
incremental gains start slowing pretty significantly. And I have to really start dialing in copywriting and whatnot to get those additional 1%, 2% gains out of
that's
the
exactly
system.
right. That's exactly
Yeah,
right.
very tough and very interesting too. With the volatility in the space too, do you think a lot of that comes down to like the core models themselves, the bots themselves, the system prompts, anything like that? Do you have any hypotheses for like how the big LLM providers are structuring this sort of stuff? Because I'm sure they have their own opinions for the evolution of the geo space, even if I haven't seen too much from them to that
Yeah,
effect
you're
yet.
talking about the people who are actually building the models, like at Anthropic and
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say, and I don't think, candidly, I don't think they really know either. I think it's difficult to predict because of the nature of how machine learning works and how neural networks function. It's difficult for them to even predict, how these models are going to behave over time, because they are, they determine for themselves in large part what is important. It's not like a hard coded thing. You probably understand this a lot more on a lot more granular level than I do as a non developer. Maybe that's something that you can talk about a little bit is to what extent are the engineers who are building these models and updating these models able to predict or have any sort of comprehensive understanding of how they're going to work, what content they're going to select at what point in time.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough from my standpoint too, because I don't have a lot of visibility into like the real specifics of their training process. One interesting thing actually to mention that you called out there is you said they aren't hard coded, but in general for these models, if you have a trained model, that relationship in terms of what their bias towards searching is actually hard coded into the neural network that underlies the entire thing. It's not hard coded in terms of like, hey, go check G2. It's more of like a systemic numerical pattern in the matrices that make up the neural network that expresses like a bias towards that. It's very interesting.
That makes sense.
Obviously, like that exists though, but then you have measures like the temperature and or biases by system prompts, context, and the prompt itself that can, despite a systemic bias towards G, for example, bias it towards Reddit in terms of a particular set of queries, for example, too. Because the way it's structured, and it's really hard to summarize in this particular venue for people that might not be visually looking at this, but there's like LLMs essentially as neural networks are kind of a way of lossily encoding a large amount of information into a fairly compact space.
Oh, I was going to have a follow up. My follow up question was going to be how is this massive amount of citation churn best explained then? So, asking the exact same query, phrase the exact same way, the tokenization could change in a month or
Mm-hmm.
two, and provide a completely different answer with completely different, supporting sources.
My knee jerk suspicion is that under the assumption that they've trained this model and the model isn't changing, if the model is changing, then that is the first like line of explanation there. There's probably additional fine tuning that they're doing that can, tweak that bias a little bit too. Rapid change like that, strongly suspect and based on what I've seen from, for example, Anthropic, is that they have these gigantic system prompts, and that there's changes to the system prompts because changing your system prompt is way easier and way cheaper than changing details of the model. If anyone's listening or watching and wants to call me on that, please do. I would love to be proven wrong because I really don't know for sure.
Yeah. No, and neither do we, which is why, the best approach as far as we can tell is to take a large set of queries, run them through the things,
Mhm.
right? Run them through the models, see what comes out on the other side, and try and infer patterns from what you're seeing coming out, and then doing that over time repeatedly, and seeing which patterns hold and which patterns don't. I think that's kind of like the scientific method applied to LLMs, right? Is you have hypotheses that you're testing with, in a repeatable manner, right? And you're seeing how the results change in these different independent experiments, let's call them.
Shane, I want to be respectful of your time. Do you want to plug your pluggables?
Sure, my pluggables. Yes. So I am the co-founder of Resonate Labs, and we help B2B businesses understand where they're showing up on LLM search for their highest intent buyers, where they're not, and help them improve that in a more or less automated way. I also want to say that my book, cited how B2B brands win in the age of AI generated answers, is kind of like, I describe it as the first practitioner grade book on GEO and building a GEO program for a B2B business. That is available on Amazon Kindle for download. But yeah, thanks for having me on, Hunter. This was a fascinating conversation, one that I'd like to continue, whether it's recorded or not. Love to talk to you more about what we're doing, and your thoughts on how we could be doing it better. But I appreciate you having me on as a guest today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for coming on. And for all of you, the listeners and viewers, thank you very much for joining. I hope this has been helpful for you. This has been a very interesting conversation on Geo for me as well, given that I'm old hat with SEO, but really, really new to Geo. So I always love getting out of my comfort zone and learning a little bit more. So I hope all of you have a fantastic day, and thank you very much for listening. Peace.